That was a bit too close, wasn't it? Eurovision 2025 is now over, and having come perilously close to the entire contest descending into oblivion, it's safe to say that it hasn't been the most peaceful weeks for most Eurovision fans' mental states in the 7 days that have passed since the final. Last year I was a little critical of how things went in Malmo, so going to Basel this year I was keen to see whether we'd see any kind of improvement. We now have our answer, and in some ways things have genuinely gotten better. Unfortunately, there are still plenty of existential level threats that are yet to be solved. And unless a lot happens in the next 12 months, it's probably going to stay that way. We might not have had a rerun of 2024 this year, but we really can't have a rerun of 2025 next year either. Today, we're going to talk about everything that unfolded last week and try and work out where it is we even go from here. There is one very obvious elephant in the room in the form of Israel's hilariously bloated televote. We will, of course, be getting to that, but there were all kinds of other factors at play this week that deserve mentioning, both in a positive and negative light, as well as, of course, talking about the song that actually won the show. Before we get started, as always, make sure to like the video, make sure to subscribe to the channel if you enjoy what I do here, and you can find all of my socials and how to support me financially in the description. In addition, don't forget that though Eurovision season is over, this channel doesn't stop making videos. We're going to keep going through the summer, so you'll have something to tide you over until we get to national final season again. Now, let's start by talking about that winner, which was JJ with his song Wasted Love from Austria. It's only fair to start here, and to be honest, to start with a confession on my part. That's that I wrote this song off during Eurovision week and had discounted its chances of winning anymore. One of the worries I had was that there was always this sense of uncertainty and nervousness in JJ's lower register. But then when it really mattered on Friday and Saturday, he stepped it up a level and all traces of nervousness disappeared. He got absolutely everything right when the push came to shove. We'll be doing a Eurovision 2025 winners and losers video next week, so make sure you're subscribed for that, and we'll go into more depth on this and several of the other songs in this year's edition in that video. What JJ's victory means is that we now have 3 jury-led winners in a row. That said, this one does feel a little bit different. While those previous 2 cleared 350 points in the jury, basically making it impossible for anyone else to win, JJ scored 258, and this was only a lead of 41 points from second place. Now, of course, in the end, that second place didn't get very close.
0 points!
But the point is, he didn't have a lead so insurmountable that the televote was rendered meaningless. Actually, a lot of different people could have won this edition. What this meant was we had a much more open televoting sequence, which under most circumstances would have been extremely exciting. Unfortunately, in these circumstances, it was definitely not, but we'll talk about that later. Seriously though, it's really good that the juries didn't bury everyone else with their scores like they did in the last 2 years and actually left it open to the public to potentially decide the winner for themselves. There were a lot of problems that I did have with their results still, such as Albania being inexplicably low on the scoreboard. But the crucial thing is that the public could have basically chosen any of the jury's top 15 to win if they felt strongly enough about it. It's only fitting then, in a year that the jury left it historically open, the public did the same, nobody scored more than 300 points, and as a result, JJ won anyway. In fairness, he did still score more than 170 from the public. In any case, if there's one thing we can all agree now, regardless of your taste on the song or the style of vocals, whether this is your kind of thing, JJ was a worthy winner. The staging was one of the very best of the year, his vocal was exceptional, and everything came together perfectly on the night. It was a first win for Taya as well as a songwriter who represented Austria at the contest in 2023, and for Sergio Hayen as a stage director. He directed Bambi Thug staging in Malmo last year and probably changed the meta at the contest forever in this respect. This was another staging straight out of the top draw from him, and he fully deserves this success. Another key talking point coming into this year's edition was the new code of conduct and filming guidelines. These were introduced to prevent incidents like the litany of complaints received about the Israeli delegation last year after their repeated harassment of other artists, which ultimately led to the EBU warning them in writing and moving them out of the delegation area entirely, to the much more infamous incident involving Joost Klein. The exact details of his altercation with a photographer remain, to be honest, a bit cloudy. All we do know is that it ultimately led to his disqualification from the show. We've talked plenty about that on this channel before, so I'm not going to go into that again now. I don't think it's helpful for what we're actually talking about here. But if there is one thing that everybody can agree on, it's that all of these incidents in the round showed that there need to be a real big change to the backstage atmosphere this year. This came in the form of really clear guidelines on what behavior was and wasn't allowed, as well as really strict filming zones, which you were absolutely not allowed under any circumstances to film outside of. On one hand, this did really work because it created these spaces where artists could just be themselves without the worry of having a camera shoved in their face. On the other hand, I have it on good authority that some delegations were a little taken aback by just how strictly this was being enforced. There were some artists who had to delete social media posts because they contained footage filmed in no filming zones, even though the footage was taken when there was absolutely nobody else around whatsoever. While that's maybe a little extreme, I think I would prefer it to be like this than for us to be in a situation like we were in last year, and overall, this seems to have been a success. That said, the atmosphere in Malmo more generally was much more fraught than in Basel, and we were never going to get the kind of stress test this year that we saw on the contest last time around, at least in this respect. In fact, until about 15 minutes before the end of the show, Basel, to be honest, was mercifully calm and seemed to be getting into the spirit of things pretty effectively. Pretty much everyone I spoke to who was in the city agreed that things were just much calmer than last year. That was until the last 15 minutes of the show. This code of conduct did have some downsides, and I think there will be some changes for next year. Some of the rules, both affecting the press and affecting the artists, were stiflingly strict, to the point that there's a very good argument that we were limiting press freedom. This was raised in the Swedish press, and in fact, the Swedish broadcaster wrote to the EBU about it. They've committed to looking at these rules again, so hopefully they will change. But it's absolutely not appropriate for a publicly funded event to have rules that suggest that if you report negatively or critically, then you could have your accreditation removed. This is something I think there's going to be a lot of dialogue on in the next 6 months, and hopefully we'll be able to end up in a much better position. I'm deciding to give the EBU the benefit of the doubt on this point, on the basis that they showed a genuine openness and a willingness to change this in the future during the week when they were asked about it. I will say though, I really feel uncomfortable with how strictly policed the artists' personal opinions are in the run-up to the contest. I'm a bit worried that we're ending up in a bit of a situation where artists feel scared to say anything about anything at all because it could risk sanction. There's a balance to be struck here, and I understand that you need to protect the artists from being put in these difficult positions in the first place. I just maybe think it's not quite right yet. Hopefully, we'll have a chance to reiterate on these things again this year, and some stuff will change. Overall, though, with the exception of the curtailing of media freedom, looking again at codes of conduct and the way in which the contest operated behind the scenes was probably a really good idea. There is a list of artists as long as my arm who have talked about how traumatic an experience the contest was, and the shorter we can keep that list going forward, the better. I will say as well, while I personally, as someone who is in the fan media ecosystem, want as much access to rehearsals as possible, not showing the first rehearsal in the Eurovision week as a broadcast feed in the press centre, but still allowing press to go and watch it in the arena but not take photos and so on, did seem to lift a little bit of pressure off the artists while still giving us something to talk about. The extra space for artists to get things right before we see stuff on the screen is probably fair enough. That said, I don't think we should go any further on this point. This really is as far as you can go in terms of restricting access. Moving forward, it was a mixed year in terms of the production of the show. On one hand, there were some really good elements, so I'm going to start with those. The stage looked genuinely stunning, and the frame idea was actually really well executed. It's honestly a shame that more people didn't use this to its fullest effect, because when it was in full use, it looked amazing. One of the best examples of this, and also one of the best interval acts of recent times, came in the form of the Carrier versus Baby Lasagna battle thing that they were doing. In addition to that, the camera work was on a level or above what we saw in Malmo last year. From a visual and technical standpoint, a lot went well. Sadly, when it came to sound, there are a lot more things that I have to bring up. Firstly was the level of the artist's vocals, which were so low in the mix. The problem here was so bad that you sometimes found the artists drowned out by the pre-recorded backing. I watched the show back this week in order to get a sense of what people saw on TV. What I saw actually really surprised me, and not in a good way. There were so many songs where it felt like so much was taken away from them by the way in which they were being produced. That brings me on to the biggest issue of all here, and something that a lot of people have already highlighted. There was a total lack of audience sound for the vast majority of this show. That was combined with the the obnoxiously loud and obviously fake applause being laid over the top. This was perhaps most obvious at the conclusion of the Israeli song. We will come back to them in a minute. These two factors in tandem took so much out of the show, and it was so frustrating to watch it drain energy out of songs that were meant to be audience favourites. My heart particularly feels for Erika Vickman here, but this also applies to Tommy Cash and others as well. Both Cha 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 and Rim Tim Taggy Dim, which formed an interval act in this very same show, based so much of their appeal on the fact that the audience was actively participating and going absolutely wild for it. By contrast, this lack of audience noise and this fake canned applause that was being added made the show feel sterile and controlled and regulated to within an inch of its life. I do of course understand that this is a TV production first and foremost, but a lot of its appeal comes from the fact that you have the live audience there too. For that reason, you do need to find a balance in the middle somewhere, and I don't feel that we were right in that balance this year. A lot of Eurovision on a basic level is about joy, and we need to hear some joy through our TVs or it's just going to take something away from it. I do genuinely find myself wondering how big an impact this had on the results. If you had been able to hear the entire crowd screaming espresso macchiato or ishkama or whatever else, they would have got significantly more public vote points than they did. Of course, regardless of what's been said, there was a pretty clear motive as to why they would want to control the sound from the audience. That's because last year, this happened. Oh, and also this.
And we're ready to start revealing the results of the grand final result.
I'm deliberately trying to keep an open mind and not be too cynical, but I'm pretty sure that the chosen solution here was to simply eliminate any possibility of this happening whatsoever. You can do that by just removing all the crowd noise. I'm pretty sure that looking back on this edition, everyone involved, and I would include the EBU and the host broadcaster in this, would see that this solution isn't really sustainable because it simply takes too much away from the show. What I am sure about in this case is that it had way more of a negative effect on the show than hearing a few boos before the Israeli song would have. Or the off chance that somebody hears the Maltese word for singing at some point. Ultimately, the easiest way to prevent the crowd booing something on the basis of it being totally morally reprehensible is simply to not have countries engaging in morally reprehensible acts participating in the show. Speaking of which, it's time to talk about Israel. This was, once again, the elephant in the room at this year's contest. I've spoken at length before about how I feel Israel is exploiting the contest, and there's a video on my channel that you can go and watch after this one on that subject. They've proved their point since then with two sad pity me ballads in 2 years. Because if there's one thing we all want to know, it's how Israel just has it so difficult right now. This one was somehow even more trite and banal than their effort last year, with a title that doesn't make grammatical sense, a single verse that was then repeated in French, and no big note because every time the singer rehearsed it, her voice cracked when she attempted it. It pushed zero musical boundaries and gave more than a hint of an early 2010s X Factor release. This kind of song ordinarily would get lost in the semi-finals or scrape through to the final and then finish like 23rd. And it gets to that position by doing reasonably with the jury and then scoring basically nothing from the public. The first half of that did come true because the juries awarded this 60 points. If we strip away all other context here, if this song was coming from any other country, 60 points from the juries, I think would have been a reasonable score. Then came the televote, where we are expected to believe that this song legitimately achieved a score of 297. Initially, during the show when I saw this, I just kind of rolled my eyes and didn't get too worried. In many ways, we had expected Israel to score highly again, because everyone had seen the voting adverts that were being constantly shoved down our throats for the entirety of Eurovision week. In addition to this, their total score of 357 didn't seem like much of a concern in terms of the potential to win the show. That's because that score of 357 has not even been in the same postcode as any winner since the new voting system was introduced in 2016. Even in the historically weird and wide open contest in 2011, converting that result to the new system still ends you up with a result of about 400 to 420 for the winner. All of that in mind, at that point, I wasn't worried yet. Then the points started rolling in from all of the other countries. One by one, countries received their points, and they didn't pass Israel. Favourites started to come and go and seemed to start underperforming. Tommy Cash came close and ended up just 1 point behind on 356. The favourite Sweden could only muster 195 from the public and found themselves 36 behind. France was over the hills and far away despite only needing to match their jury score of 180 to get past them. Switzerland somehow ended up with 0 points from the public, having scored 216 from the juries. By the way, that is the biggest jury televote disagreement in the history of the contest. Eventually, we were left with just Israel and Austria on the final split screen. And let's be honest, we were all shitting ourselves at this point, weren't we? I'm sure that a lot of possibilities were flashing through basically everyone watching's minds at this moment. And not many of the possibilities were particularly good. I've seen some argument that you could even see that fear spelled out on Hazel, one of the hosts' face. By the way, Hazel was hilarious, and if Eurovision is back in Switzerland anytime soon, I really want her back as a host again. Anyway, back to the point. I don't think there's any need to be coy about this in any way. A Eurovision Song Contest hosted in Israel now probably would have been its death. At the very least, it would have done potentially irreparable damage both to the number of participants and to its reputation. For a lot of Eurovision fans, it would have meant not following the contest entirely, either for a year or for good. Thankfully, we dodged that bullet by a whisker because Austria did score more than the 100 points they needed to overtake Israel and win. The thing is that isn't really the point here. We need to focus in on that 297 points scored by Israel from the public. Let's call a spade because this is so obviously manipulated that it would probably be funny if it wasn't so existentially dangerous for the entire event. All of the traditional indicators of televote success, whether that's streaming numbers, chart performance, downloads, whatever else, did not apply to the Israeli song. In addition to that, it's been nowhere since the contest finished. Nobody is listening to this because it didn't capture the broader European public's imagination. Further to that, it received a list of 12s which were almost identical to the countries that gave 12 points to Eden Golan last year. There is remarkably little difference in where the points came from. Unfortunately, once again, the Israeli government, not the broadcaster, not the artist, the government themselves, has spent millions on advertising this song, placing particular emphasis on the fact you can vote up to 20 times. In addition to that, we once again had the ridiculous parade of right-wing politicians bragging about how they don't watch the contest, but were going to make sure to cast the maximum number of votes for Israel on the night. This kind of advertising is not targeted at Eurovision fans like you or me. It's aimed at those who already have a strong sympathy with Israel and have little to no interest in the contest or its welfare. This very thin wedge of people will happily vote 20 or 40 or 60 times for Israel, using multiple credit cards or multiple SIM cards, and subsequently steal a huge number of points away from artists who've actually earned it. The voting volumes at Eurovision are really not that high, and most people split their votes between several countries or only vote once or twice in total. As a result, each one of these people who is willing to vote 20 or 40 or 60 times for Israel wields a hugely disproportionate amount of power. Israel knows it can mobilize these people to vote for them and produce a kind of illusion of public support. Or even better, drag the contest illegitimately to Tel Aviv next year for yet another exercise in demonstrating how liberal and tolerant they are to distract from the man-made disaster that they are inflicting down the road. This year, it was in even sharper contrast to what happened in 2024. Even Israelis on social media were conceding that this result was very obviously ridiculous. There is no world in which this song legitimately receives 297 points from the public, regardless of the circumstances, and I am not alone in this view. In the week since the final, a litany of broadcasters have demanded reforms and audits of the voting process. It is absolutely imperative that this factor is safeguarded against in future contests. The good news is that absolutely are things that can and hopefully will be done to make this happen. The first is a no-brainer in my view, and that is dramatically slash the number of votes that can be made from each device and each credit card. Realistically, nobody actually needs more than 3 votes, with the exception of a small number of diehards like me. That means that even if every other vote duplication safeguard fails, it takes dramatically more resources to produce this kind of result and to get this many votes disproportionately for a single act. Secondly, as I just mentioned, we do need more safeguards to prevent people from voting multiple times. SIM cards are extremely cheap, extremely easy to buy en masse, and extremely easy to quickly swap in and out of phones in order to cast hundreds of votes potentially in a short period. Voting online, at least in the countries which use it, is bound specifically to the credit card that you use to make the transaction. I have a pretty simple suggestion here. Number 1, just abolish phone voting entirely. Number 2, in the app, firstly, only permit 3 votes, like I said. Secondly, lock the app once people have voted. Allow them to make 1 transaction and 1 transaction only. In most cases, people are using either Apple or Android devices. So in addition, you could secure this further by making them tie the app to either their Apple or Google accounts and then disabling logins and logouts once you've committed your vote for the night. You can't completely prevent all voting shenanigans, and there will always be people who try to game the system. But what you can do is make it much more logistically difficult to do, and therefore much more expensive. That makes it much less likely to have this kind of huge distorting effect on the overall result. If serious action isn't taken immediately to turn back the clock on this kind of manipulation, it poses an existential threat to the contest. The entire results become completely illegitimate, and that competition element that underpins the entire event simply falls apart. We've had plenty of diaspora voting effects before, and in general, we've managed to manage these in such a way that they don't have a huge distorting effect overall. We have never had anything on as extreme a scale as we have now. I know there are some people who've cited Ukraine in 2022 as a similar example, but actually those are very different scenarios. There was no coordinated campaign to vote for Ukraine in 2022. That was organic, it came from individuals. It wasn't a top-down organized campaign and didn't involve encouraging people to game the system by voting as many times as humanly possible. Despite all of this discussion, there is of course another way to easily fix this problem, at least in the case of Israel. That's by simply removing them from the contest. I understand the position that the EBU is in to an extent. They're bound to the lines that the national broadcasters that make up their membership set. The national broadcasters will not go against the geopolitical positions of the states that they represent. That said, with the latest developments in Gaza, we have seen many European countries, including major ones such as France and the UK, slowly but surely modulate their positions little by little to become increasingly critical of what Israel is doing in Palestine. If this continues, this may finally be the year where political cover becomes enough for broadcasters to take action. That's what we've started to hopefully see this week. While we're here, I'm going to dispel a couple of myths quickly. Number one, that the EBU can simply decide to do this by themselves. The answer is no, they probably can't. And we shouldn't forget that Russia was removed because the broadcasters who made up the EBU called for it. And number two, no, Israel is not being kept in because the sponsor is Moroccan oil. If you seriously think that the future of an international competition on this scale is bound to a relatively small amount of money coming from a mid-sized hair care company, then I would encourage you to look at your logic again, because that makes no sense. In addition, I'm fairly sure that contract is up this year. We might see new sponsors in 2026. In any case, I'm getting really sick of spending Eurovision worrying about whether there will be a contest to follow next year, and I'm so fed up of Israel's blatant abuse both of the contest and of all the ideals that it allegedly stands for. If we truly want to heal the contest going forward, that means going forward to a future where, at least for the foreseeable, Israel is not a participant. By the way, to the Israelis who are inevitably about to write hate comments now, it's very unoriginal to call me a traitor to my own people or anything similar to that. I've had lots of that over the last year. For a state that claims to defend and represent Jewish people, you sure forget those values real quick when this one decides to have an opinion that you disagree with. Overall, this has been a weird year. Definitely a better year than Malmo, but ended with a close call unlike anything we had in the results sequence of 2024. It's good that we've gotten to grips with the backstage environment in such a way that seems to be better for the artists overall. But there is a lot more still to be done. In the week since, like I said, we've seen broadcasters raising the alarm, and hopefully that means things are going to change. Last year, I made a video saying that Eurovision was a complete disaster. This year, it was not. But we did get dangerously close to it for a brief moment on Saturday night. To be honest, I'd be very surprised if everyone working at the EBU wasn't shitting themselves just as much as we all were. In any case, what it means is it's time to change the contest to ensure we're never in this position again. We do have a new ESC director entering their first full year in the job. That means rather than entering a moving train like it is when you go into the job for the first year, he'll actually be involved in the early planning stages and in some of the parts where we can make changes. In addition to that, we have a brand new reference group being chaired by the most critical broadcaster of Israel in the form of Spain's RTVE. Hopefully, they'll have an appetite to make some difference as well. I am choosing to spend this year living in hope. For now, this is the end of the video, but the season is not quite over yet. We have another video coming out next week discussing this year's winners and losers, and the week after, I'll be going through everything that I got wrong at Eurovision this year. Spoiler alert, it's a lot. I hope I'll see you there, but for now, this week, take care, and I'm looking forward to seeing you again in 7 days.